political principles. We'd just like to illustrate the way in which it came about on purely political principles. First of all, if we go back to the time period that's indicated there, it will be in a moment, this is going into about 1897, 1898, the trial of Captain Dreyfus in Paris, who was court-martialed and jailed for treason. But it was a remarkable event because it was quite clear that this was a miscarriage of justice on preconceived notions, because Captain Dreyfus had this one characteristic that alienated him from a lot of people in France: he was a Jew. Later, in response to the newspaper article that you see at the bottom right, he was retried and exonerated completely. But what happened at that time was that there was a newspaper reporter, a young newspaper reporter named Theodore Herzl, and he witnessed the events. He went to report on the trial. He saw the anti-Semitism that led people nearly to break down the courtroom doors. And so he determined at that time that he would set about establishing a Zionist movement, not to give any glory to God, but to seek a home for the Jewish people who clearly were persecuted all over the globe. It's interesting just to see, again, going back about 50 years before these events took place, the interpretation of prophecy caused this to be written: "The restoration of the Jews is a work of time and will require between 50 and 60 years to accomplish." In 1848, wasn't even on people's agenda at that time. We notice here an extract from a book on Israelitish history, how that Theodore Herzl said when he established the first Zionist Congress in 1897, he said, "At Baal I founded the Jewish state." Although it was still in the future, this is where it all began in his view. He went on to say, "Perhaps in 5 years and certainly in 50, everyone will know it." In other words, that the Jewish state has been founded. He said at that time people would laugh if he'd have proclaimed that publicly. But there it is. 51 years later, the state of Israel was declared, exactly in accordance with Bible prophecy that it should be so. Now, again, just dwelling on this one step further, this man, Chaim Weizmann, who was a very notable Jew, was a chemist, as you perhaps be able to read on the right-hand side. The significance of this man, apart from the fact that he was he was head of the Zionist movement in Britain, was that he was a chemist. And because of his ingenuity, he developed synthetic explosives at a time when the World War I was going very sadly awry for the British people. All their supplies of the necessary ingredients to make explosives were being scuppered by the German U-boats that were sinking the ships bearing the commodities into the UK. And so Weizmann developed synthetic explosives, and it was on the basis of these that the depth charges were developed, which brought to an end the dominance of the German U-boats. Now, we reiterate that because, as you'll see in a moment, this was all seeming to be an improbable set of circumstances, but this is how it developed. Because the British government felt such a debt of gratitude to Chaim Weizmann, they in fact agreed that they would take up his desire of pursuing the course of a home for the Jews. That's where it started, purely on political principles, exactly as we would understand it from the Bible. The question now then of assuming the sovereignty over the land of Israel. And again, we'd like to quote this extract. We're not putting this on a pedestal, but again, as we say, just to indicate how prophecy was understood and was understandable before these events, 50 years before these events took place. This is what was written. "I know not whether the men who at present contrive the foreign policy of Britain entertain the idea of assuming the sovereignty of the Holy Land and of promoting its colonisation by the Jews. Their present intentions, however, are of no importance one way or the other, because they will be compelled by events soon to happen to do what under existing circumstances heaven and earth combined could not move them to attempt." Well, that was how it was seen, that no way would Britain ever get involved in this set of circumstances. But we've seen actually the reason why they might get involved. They will be compelled by events soon to happen. And we've just been looking at those events that were soon to happen. And what was the result of this? What became known as the Balfour Declaration. And there is a copy of the facsimile of the Balfour Declaration. And if you can't read it, you probably will be able to, but the second paragraph reads, His Majesty's government view with favour the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people and will use their best endeavours to facilitate the achievement of this object. Now that was absolutely remarkable that came 50 years after the statement on the left. Not that the statement was remarkable, it was the prophecy that was remarkable that led to this conclusion. This was the interpretation fully vindicated by the fact that the British government did what heaven and earth combined would not normally have moved them to do. But the circumstances in the First World War moved them to send that Balfour Declaration on November the 2nd, 1917. Well, what of this protective power? If we turn to the prophecy through Isaiah and the 18th chapter, this is one of many prophecies that deals with the development of the circumstance of the time. In Isaiah chapter 18, and reading from verse 1, we read there, woe, or as the idea is, ho, it's appealing. Listen to this. Ho to the land shadowing with wings, which is beyond the rivers of Ethiopia, that sendeth ambassadors by the sea, even in vessels of bulrushes upon the waters. Symbolic language, but it's quite clearly a power which is an island power, because the only way it can send its ambassadors is by sea. We may say that in these days, well, air travel is a run-of-the-mill thing, but certainly at the time these events are speaking of, it was down to sea travel. That sendeth ambassadors by the sea, saying, further in the verse, go ye swift messengers to a nation scattered and peeled, to a people terrible from their beginning hitherto, a nation meted out and trodden down, whose land the rivers have spoiled, a waste land. All ye inhabitants of the world and dwellers on the earth, see ye when he lifteth up an ensign on the mountains, and when he bloweth a trumpet, hear ye. So that was a question of summoning people to look at the signs that they would see around them, the development of circumstances that would be quite remarkable. Well, that's the passage that we've just read. And so what were the developments? You might not be able to see it, but there's some rivers just appearing to the right of the Mediterranean. The arrow, that's a country which is beyond the rivers of Ethiopia, and the arrow will take us straight to India. It talks about a land shadowing with wings. But we've actually drawn that in the way that is implied by the prophecy. The body of the bird is actually over the land where the prophecy related to. The protective wings stretch from, in the one hand on the right as far as India, which is where the British power was concentrated 100 or so years ago, and it points with the other wingtip to the origin of that power. And it led, because of an understanding of the prophecy, when these events were not even thought about, generally speaking, the writer wrote, to Britain then the prophet calls as the protector of the Jewish nation in the evening tide trouble, and commands it to send its messengers in swift vessels, because the crisis is urgent, and to plant Israel as an ensign upon the mountains. What followed was, by the League of Nations mandate, Israel took control of Palestine. You can see there the red boundary. It's almost red on the diagram. The Palestinian mandate granted to Britain at the conference in 1920 as a region of a Jewish national home. Britain then chose to separate out part of that land that was under its jurisdiction for the establishment of what was known as Transjordan at that time, given to Emir Abdullah. And it's interesting to look at the accounts. There is a letter in the book that I referred to earlier, The History of Israel, which came out to celebrate the 60th anniversary. And it clearly indicates that the Arab peoples, the predecessor of the Emir Abdullah, wrote a letter saying he fully understood the need for a home for the Jews in the land. He said there are people on both sides that are